Thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. As the chairman explained, my name is Bowie, Randall Bowie. I'm from a company, Rockwool International. It's a fairly large insulation company, one of the largest, so it has a certain interest in energy efficiency. It's a big company, about 10,000 employees all over the world. It's a global company. But before I jump into my presentation, I could say a few words after Pedro Ballesteros' very interesting presentation. I worked a lot with Pedro in the Commission. I spent quite a few years in the European Commission writing legislation, and was actually the desk officer for the first EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So I think that's why Pedro wanted me to come down and say a few words about the legislation. But I agree completely with Pedro's remarks about the importance of getting the balance between Brussels and the local actors. It's quite important, and there's a lot that has to be decided at the local level. So I support him completely on his covenant of mayors. What I would like to do is to say a few words about the general legislative framework that Brussels has put together, and some of the individual requirements where there are some synergies, and then the fact that a lot of the legislation is up for revision this next 2 years, 2015 and 2017. It is a good opportunity to make some small and perhaps very important adjustments. The main pieces of legislation are, of course, the recast EPBD from 2010, which includes almost all of the important buildings legislative bits and pieces, but also the Energy Efficiency Directive from 2012, which has several articles on buildings, including this famous Article 4 on the renovation roadmaps. There's some other pieces. There's the Construction Products Regulation, and which includes the CE marking. It's an attempt to harmonize the quality with basic work requirements 7 on the environmental impacts. And of course, the other pieces of legislation which impact on buildings, eco-design has a big impact on the heating systems, boilers, for example, and the associated labels. This is now under review. It's becoming more and more into so-called energy-related products. There's even discussion on eventually someday having an eco-design implementing directive for buildings, but this is something in the future, and it's quite complicated for the very reason that buildings are very much local issue. A lot has to be determined by the building cultures locally. Sustainable buildings, the earlier DG Environment has spent a lot of time moving towards sustainability. As you get down to nearly zero energy buildings, the use phase, the energy in the use phase becomes less important, and the energy and the embedded energy in the products takes new importance. The energy product declarations are an important instrument in determining the environmental impacts of buildings. And now the resource efficiency agenda in the Commission is becoming important. Recycling of waste, cradle to cradle, and reducing waste, increasing the amount of recycling of construction waste especially, where landfills are becoming almost illegal. And of course, standardization continues to be very important in developing the internal market for buildings and building products. SEN, there are now requirements or mandates to develop audits, energy audits, which include mainly buildings, energy management systems, including the EN ISO 50001, and then the sustainability, a set of sustainability standards, SIN TC 350. But this is just to give you an idea, there is a lot of work going on within buildings, and it's all interrelated. If you look at some more detail, into a lot more detail about the legislation, I think one of the first things you'll be struck by is a little, sometimes not that well-known regulation, which comes from the EPBD, Article 5. It's about cost optimal levels. It's a way of calculating your energy performance. And it's now a requirement for all the member states, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, to calculate and benchmark their building codes using net present values and life cycle costing, a long-term calculation methodology to see if the existing codes, including thermal insulation codes, or so-called cost optimal. Could they be improved? This is becoming more and more important, and there are a lot of applications of this, like in the EED Article 7, which is an energy supplier obligation to save 1.5% a year. In order to be eligible for credit, you have to meet the building codes have to be at least cost optimal. So it's already being applied for things like this target, this 1.5% target in the Energy Efficiency Directive. But it's also in the structural and investment funds, cohesion, what were earlier called cohesion funds, through the use of so-called ex-ante conditionality. That means that in order to get these funds, you have to meet certain requirements, one of which now is cost optimal. It's actually mentioned in the rules and regulations. And also going back to the basic EPBD, the Article 4, which tells member states to do building codes, there is a reference to cost optimal. So this is all over the place, but it's mainly moving into a longer term net present value calculation and moving a life cycle and moving away from the simple payback calculations. So it's an important development. And they're also in the process now of improving this even more by putting in the so-called second generation EPBD SIN standards on how to calculate performance. All of this goes out on better ways to calculate energy performance. So there is a mandate from the Commission for SIN, the standardization body, to develop a second generation of standards to calculate efficiency or performance in buildings. There are a lot of bilateral meetings now between the Commission and the member states to check their ways of working with cost optimality. One area which is causing a considerable amount of difficulty, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, is the nearly zero energy buildings. This is in Article 5 in the EPBD. As you know, by the end of 2018, the public sector is supposed to, all the member states have agreed, have signed under to make their new buildings nearly zero energy buildings. And by the end of 2020, all buildings, even the private sector buildings, will be nearly zero energy buildings. Problem is, there are a lot of different definitions of nearly zero energy buildings. So now the Commission is scurrying to try to get some type of, not harmonization, it's very difficult to harmonize that concept, but at least some convergence so that you have some common ground and common ideas. It's once again a balancing act, and I think Pedro made the point too that it's between getting the general directives from Brussels but allowing member states to decide a lot themselves, and they will decide a lot on what they want to call nearly zero energy buildings. So it's a moving target, but it's an exciting area, and a lot is happening now. Commission is preparing by the end of this year a new guidance document on nearly zero energy buildings. One area which has had huge potential but has never really been successfully used is so-called energy performance certificates. These are mentioned very clearly and were developed in the recast of the EPBD in 2010 and made more important, but they're still, it's in Article 11 of the EPBD, still not really there. It could be much more well-developed. It could be made into so-called energy passports, where France is proposing this, where the certificates actually follow the building throughout the lifetime of the building. There are a lot of ideas, but the member states, some are doing pretty good work, others are very, very slow, and they have extremely weak certificates. They need to be more closely developed to financing and also to the recommendations. There are requirements in the directive to come with recommendations, but not many are that useful. So there are wide variations in these. There is a new study which will be published in a couple of weeks from the BPIE, which is the Building Performance Institute Europe in Brussels. They're doing some good work on researching the existing legislation. I would keep an eye out for this report. It'll be on their website in a few weeks. But it will show that the certificates are not being used properly. You need a major push. And I think in the present discussion in Brussels to revise this directive and to even revise the EED, there's a unique opportunity to improve the energy performance certificates. There is another article, Article 11.9 in the EPBD on so-called voluntary schemes for commercial buildings. This was a parliamentary amendment which was put in at the last minute, which is now being put to the test. They're going to use it to check to see if you can harmonize energy performance certificates quite a bit more than they are today. You don't need to try to read this, but this is a page from this forthcoming report by BPIE, which gets into very fine detail on how the member states are doing their certificates and how they're checking them. This is just to give you an idea. It's worth reading this report because the data, it has good data. They're looking at how many EPCs were actually carried out in the different member states, how many were tested. There is a requirement in the directive to do a statistically significant test to see if they're correctly done. This just is to give you an idea. There is good data here, so it's worth visiting. The same report has a lot of information on the way the member states are checking the quality of their certificates, the different types of bodies, whether it's a central government body, a regional government, or a professional, or a third-party body. But this is not yet published, so I can't give you a copy of it yet. But in a week, it'll be available. But it has some good information on exactly how the EPBD has been implemented. In a minute, I'll show a few figures on the fact that the EPBD is still not completely implemented. There are 4 member states who are being fined, very high fines every day because they're not in compliance with the EPBD. And there are even others who are not yet fined but are not yet implementing it. EPBD has been a very slow directive to be implemented. This study will show this. This same here on it's very important that there are accreditation bodies. As you see, a lot of the member states do not yet have accreditation bodies to accredit those who are doing the certification of the buildings. So there's a lot of work yet to be done here. But the study will show how those who have put it in place how they're actually carrying out the qualification, the checking, accreditation, and qualification of the experts, which is very important, because if you're going to have energy performance certificates, you really need good people doing the inspections. And I think that there's a link here too to historical buildings, because if you do a good job, you can actually make them very aware of historical buildings, even though the way the directive is set up, most historical buildings can be exempted. I think this is something that the law should reconsider and make them, maybe allow them to be exempted, but encourage the proper use and preservation of these buildings, as has been shown in the earlier presentations. Technology is there to do it. And then the Article 4 in the EED, which is the first attempt to try to get the renovation sector, which is where the biggest potential is. As far as energy savings, we all know that new build is about 1% a year, so it's a very small share of the total. But the existing stock is huge. But this article, unfortunately, is very weak. It primarily asks the member states to develop plans to improve financing and a longer-term strategy. It hasn't really been carried out. There's a new study coming out in a couple of weeks too from BPIE to show that this is also the case. At the same time, the European Parliament, the NGOs, trade organizations have done many studies showing that the potential there's about an 80% potential to improve the existing building stock by 2050. But you'll have to use some very deep renovations. These are renovations where you can improve the performance by 60, 70, 80%. There's also a need to link this Article 4 to financing. The Commission is now doing that. More and more you're seeing links to the investment funds, structural investment funds. And also there's an Article 8 in the EED on audits. There's a strong movement now to try to make it mandatory that some of the recommendations from these audits, which are both for industry and buildings, some of the recommendations should be implemented by funding from the member states. This is a bit controversial, but I think it's time to try to push it once again to make these recommendations, the ones that are very cost effective, make them eligible for special financing and funding. The idea of deep renovations has been around for a while, but it's still not completely appreciated. But if you look at the fact that if we are talking about, and we have to, this 2-degree, the need to avoid, the 2-degree temperature increase in the climate change debate, you have to reduce CO2 by 80 to 95%. The only way you can do that is with buildings, because the largest potential is buildings, but 40% of consumption is in buildings. And it's existing buildings, of course, because new build is so small. And the renovation rate today is very low, 1%, needs to be raised to 3% at least. You need to avoid these so-called quick and dirty renovations of 20%, because everything indicates that most of the older buildings can be improved by 60 to 90%. If you do it incorrectly, if you do a shallow renovation, you'll lock in these savings often for 30 years, because there's a renovation cycle which is about 30 years long. Another area which is being missed is the many so-called ancillary co-benefits of doing deep renovations. The health effects, indoor climate, comfort, the real estate values increase. It affects macroeconomics, your foreign balance, security of supply. So deep renovations need really to be given a lot of extra thought and effort. There is a chance to improve this Article 4 in the coming debate. And I think it's possible to do it. This just gives an idea of what the lock-in effect is. If you can follow the reasoning, there are two things. There's a rate of renovation. You can see there are different rates. There's 1.5, 2, and a 3 point. With a very good rate of renovation, 3, and a very deep renovation, you can go down. You add all those together. The lock-in effect is about 80%. If you don't do it correctly, you lock in about 80%. As far as the potentials, there are plenty of strong figures showing the well-built studies showing the potentials. Recently, the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany did one, which showed in the residential sector by 2030, this is just by 2030, you can have a 61% savings in the residential sector. So you have huge. The tertiary sector is less, 38, but the savings are there. And when it comes to this discussion that's going on in Brussels now over the 2030 targets, I'm sure you're hearing about those. They've pretty much agreed to a greenhouse gas target for 2030 of 40%. But the best way to reach that is efficiency, and they're not really agreeing to a high or an ambitious efficiency target. They're having trouble agreeing, so they're talking about a 30%. It could easily be a 40% savings target for efficiency too. When the Commission came out in July with its communication, they came to the conclusion that things were pretty much on track. I think this is a bit misleading, to be honest with you. They've shown that they've decoupled GDP from consumption, energy consumption. Some of that, however, is due to the recession, probably about a third of it. They've shown that the new cars are about 27% more efficient. Buildings, of course, consume about 40% less. There are a huge number of Class A refrigerators. There were 5%, Class A was 5% in 1995. Now Class A's are more than 90%. Industry has improved its efficiency. So a lot of good has happened, but I don't think it's correct to think that we don't need to do more. This is what is happening now in Brussels. There's a risk that they will sort of rest on their laurels, as they say, and just take it easy. Now is actually the time to take advantage of the fact that some progress has been made to go even further. One thing that was positive is this Article 7, the energy efficiency obligation. It looks like there will be about 16 member states who will develop or give their utilities an obligation to save energy, which I think is good because the beauty of utilities is they can finance it. They have the financing. And of course, huge improvements in the structural and cohesion or investment funds now. There are about 38 billion euros available for improving for the low carbon economy, especially buildings. So there's a good chance to use some of that. And there's a lot of conditionalities requiring them, if they meet the legislation, they get access to this funding. And there's some new mechanisms too. This just shows briefly the arguments being used that we have broken the link between GDP and energy consumption. As you see, the prediction is that energy consumption will fall even while GDP continues to increase. This is to a certain extent true, but some of it, I'm afraid, some of the forecasting, the broken line there is influenced by the recession. It may not be quite as much of a downturn, because if we ever get an increased GDP, consumption will probably increase somewhat. But I agree that we have pretty much broken the link. But this is a bit overly dramatic, I'm afraid, at the prediction there. I don't think it'll fall that quickly if there is a return or the recession actually ends. And the conclusion, of course, of all of in July was that we don't need to do that much more. We will work with the member states with their national action plans. As I said, only 6 member states have fully transposed the EED, and there are 9 member states who have not yet transposed the EPBD from 2010. The deadline here was actually 2012, so they're several years behind. And 4 are being fined daily for heavy fines for non-compliance, or non-application, as it's called. And of course, it looks like the 2020 target of 20% may be met, about almost coming close to 18-19%, but about a third of this is probably due to the recession. But anyway, the Commission has concluded that we don't need too much new legislation, so they're going to try to get by with small improvements, but it's still an opportunity when it goes to the Parliament and the Council to come with amendments, small amendments which can improve it, because there are several review processes in the next 2 years. The way it is now, they'll continue at the same rate, roughly 2% savings per year, and they will probably vote at the summit in the 23rd to have a 30% target, which is a low target, and it'll give about a 2% per year improvement. This is what the outcome will be. Since it's a consensus-based discussion in the Council, the summit, this is the heads of state on the 23rd and 24th of October. They will probably go for an EU level target without any effort sharing, but they will have some governance where they'll report back to the Commission, and they will have some possibility to make sure that the member states do work toward developing their own self-imposed energy savings targets. But setting a 30% makes it relatively low ambition, unfortunately. To conclude, just as an afterthought, even in little Denmark, there's a lot of thought going into improving heritage buildings, especially even on the facades. They're spending a lot of time trying to preserve the quality. I think Spain and Southern Europe probably has more buildings to worry about, but Denmark has quite a few too. But there is a lot of effort to preserve them now and to increase the efficiency. So we do get some fairly nice looking buildings too in Denmark as we go forward. But the legislation from the Commission isn't really helping too much on the heritage side, but I think there is a possibility to do something with it. Thank you.